Hello and welcome to the KE Collaborative webinar today. My name is Sarita Quavo and I'm a knowledge broker at the Mental Health Commission of Canada. On behalf of the KE Collaborative project team, we would like to thank you for joining us today. So before getting into our speakers' presentations, I just want to go over a couple of things. Please remember that the audio for this webinar is provided in broadcast mode through your computer speakers, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. If you have any trouble, check the audio settings on your computer or contact Adobe Connect, and the phone number is provided on the slide. Also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the MHCC website at a later date. On your screen, you will see a chat feature as well as a Q&A box. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat as well as the Q&A box to submit your questions. We will be holding questions until the end of the presentation. Also right now, you should also be able to download the slide deck on the top right of your screen. You just select the file and click Download Files. So again, welcome everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will explore how to select an appropriate innovation to bring about positive change in your organization or community. And I am pleased to introduce our speakers. First up, we will have Liz Wigful, who is the manager at the Knowledge Exchange Center at the MHCC, where she heads up the SPARK training program and leads a team of knowledge brokers who work on a variety of projects related to population-based mental health. She has been leading the MHCC SPARK training program and teaching others about the Innovation to Implementation Guide since 2013. We also have Kim Baker, who is an implementation supervisor within the Provincial System Support Program at CAMH. Kim is currently leading transformative provincial implementation projects. And Kim's 20-year career in health and social services includes clinical work training, health promotion, and system planning. So with that, I would like to introduce and invite Liz Wigful.
Thanks, Rita, and welcome everybody who's on the line today. We're really happy to have you join us for our second webinar related to the new Knowledge Exchange Collaborative that we're been getting off the ground with colleagues at CCSA. And today, as Rita said, we're going to be talking about choosing the right innovation. So you can see here, I put up a funny slide. Some of you will have seen this before, saying that the latest research shows that we really should do something with all this research. So really this is about how do we get knowledge out to the right people so it can be used to make positive change. If research is just sitting on the shelf or other types of knowledge as well, or just staying in one place and not being shared with others, then it becomes, well, it's kind of pointless in a way, but it doesn't do much good if it's just sitting, you know, on your work shelf or in a folder on your computer. So how do we get the knowledge to make great practice change? So there are certain reasons why knowledge does not make it into practice. And we could divide those reasons into two blocks. One that relates to knowledge translation. There's not adequate knowledge translation going on. And the other two relate more to implementation science. So meaning there's a way that implementation science can address these reasons that things are not happening as they should be. So under knowledge translation, a lot of people aren't even aware that certain knowledge exists. And often actually when people do come to the SPARK training program, we invite them to be sure they do an environmental scan before they decide to choose the innovation that they want to implement. To make sure it hasn't been done before, so they're not starting from scratch. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of great things out there already. So knowledge translation can help people become aware of different types of innovations. Another way is that knowledge translation is not presented in a usable way. It's not presented in plain English or plain French. It's not understandable to a lot of us. And I think, a lot of us like to think that we understand what academic articles are saying, but sometimes they don't. And people don't necessarily have the time to read those, so what can be given to them so that they can use the knowledge that they're given. In terms of relevance, there's knowledge that exists, but it doesn't actually answer the problems faced by decision makers. So aligning research and knowledge up with what's needed is going to be a lot more useful and helpful. In terms of recognition, so the source of the knowledge is not valued, and traditionally we've only valued knowledge that came from the academic world through what we call evidence-based practice. What does that mean? Is it only things that have been validated through a study of some sort? And that's just not true. So there are different kinds of knowledge, and I'll be talking about those in a couple of minutes. In terms of implementation science, there are barriers to implementation where there is awareness, but there are barriers to change. So if you want to implement an innovation in your organization, it can be difficult because the organization might not be ready for it. So there has to be the right time, it has to be the right fit to solve the problem that you're looking at. And again, in implementation science, behavior change. So everything else is in peace, but individual and organizational behavior change is very difficult to achieve. You need to get people on board, and I'm sure a lot of people have been at the receiving end of a decision that impacted them, but they had no input into, and it can cause resistance. So implementation science can help with this. So I'm going to focus more on a little bit around knowledge translation, or KT, and we have a common definition for this, which is bridging the gap between what we know and what we do. And there are all kinds of fancy definitions, but we're sticking with this one because it's it's plain and easy to understand. In terms of the different kinds of knowledge, they're of different sources, and as I was saying, it's difficult to see where it's valued sometimes. We have the scientific knowledge, which is learning through research, which is generally very well accepted, and is where we often call evidence-based. But there's also experiential, so that's learning through experience, learning through the experience of people who have mental illness or addiction or substance use problems. So validating their experience of the system and listening to those people. There's pragmatic knowledge too, so that's from learning through action. So pragmatic knowledge really focuses on the knowledge that people who work in the system bring. So we're talking about nurses and counselors, social workers, occupational therapists, physicians, psychiatrists, or anyone who works with these populations. And finally, cultural, which is learning through being. So that's the knowledge we bring from the environment that we grew up in and live in now. So it could be an ethnocultural environment or simply a geographic one. It's quite subjective, but it is very important to check in with people around this stuff as well. And we talked about all of these things in the Innovation to Implementation Guide, which is our workbook that we use at the Spark training program to guide people through creating a knowledge translation plan. And back here at the I-to-I cycle, it's a 7-step cycle. It's very simple, and we have it in a particular order here, but just to let you know, it is flexible, and you can move parts of it around depending on your needs if you use it. So the tool should suit you, and not the other way around. So the first step is state the purpose. So I'm going to start there. And when you're talking about your purpose, you're thinking about what problems you're trying to address. So why are you even doing this KT plan in the first place, or implementation plan? What is the problem you're trying to fix? Is there a practice or a policy that you're trying to improve? What are your objectives, and what are the desired outcomes? So you don't have to answer all of these questions, but it does help to think through them as you hone in on your purpose and why you're doing it in the first place, because this is going to help you in the later stages of the cycle. And I have an example just from everyday life. So in terms of if I was creating my purpose according to the I-to-I, think about the problem, which is that my family is in need of a break from day-to-day life, too much work, too much school, and too much winter maybe. And what am I trying to improve? Well, family connectedness and family wellness. For objectives, I wrote, well, we could do something together which is fun and refreshing, and the desired outcome is to return to work feeling relaxed and in a happy state of mind and feeling connected to other family members. That sounds like a pretty good outcome. So this is just an example, and I think something that most people can relate to on some level. So then we know what the purpose is, so now we're going to select an innovation. So what is it that is going to help us meet our purpose? And an innovation, according to the I-to-I, is a product, action, service, or relationship that has the potential to enhance health outcomes. So it could be a wide range of things. It doesn't have to be a set of guidelines, or it doesn't have to be a policy. It could be a forum. It could be stakeholder engagement. It could be a wide range of things. In fact, here are some innovations that we've put together from previous experience. So as you can see here, it could be anti-stigma training. It could be effective youth engagement strategies. It could be in the e-mental health world of using apps to deliver counseling in remote areas, so on and so forth. Putting your innovation in the middle. So what is your innovation that's going to help meet your purpose? So with that, I'm going to hand over to Kim, who's going to take us through the next part.
Great. Thank you, Liz. And please do type in the chat box, anyone, if there's a problem hearing me, if my volume isn't quite right for you. So thanks, Liz and colleagues at the Mental Health Commission of Canada for inviting me to participate today. Just a little bit about the Provincial System Support Program before I get into selecting your innovation. So PSSP is an entity within the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health that works collaboratively with communities to improve mental health and addiction supports for people across Ontario. We have a whole range of different tools that we bring to bear to improve the system, including knowledge exchange, evaluation, health equity, and implementation expertise to support communities to plan and attempt and evaluate their system improvement work. So we've been using implementation science as a framework for quite a number of years now. And there's particular tools within implementation science that can be employed at different points in your project or your work that can really help you to move forward with your innovation. And it really begins with identifying what innovation meets your needs. So I'm going to provide just a really little bit of foundational information about implementation science and the implementation frameworks. only in service to you understanding where these tools or the process of selection fits within that bigger framework. So implementation science is the study of factors that influence the full and effective use of evidence-based innovations in practice. So it's a process that, as Liz mentioned earlier, can help you to close that research to practice gap. It helps you to make decisions, to develop very specific plans to implement your innovation, your program, your practice. It's purposeful in terms of planning and structuring activities that will help you to implement as you intend. And it also helps you to think about evaluating your implementation to ensure that you get those outcomes that you desire. So the tools that we'll discuss, the hexagon tool and the practice profile, are part of the toolkit of implementation science. So then implementation essentially is a specified set of activities designed to put into practice an activity or program of known dimensions. And that concept of known dimension is really important because that's actually what we're trying to hone in on. So selecting and defining your innovation is about being very concrete about what you intend to implement. I often use analogies, and it's, the analogy of a recipe is something that most people can relate to. So this is the recipe for your innovation that's very clear and very specific. And the reason for this is so that people can benefit from the research, from the evidence, from the good practices that we implement. So this is just a visual depiction of all of the sort of pieces of the implementation puzzle. So to achieve the positive outcomes that we want to achieve, you need a good innovation, a good program, a practice. You need enabling context, so that's sort of the hospitable environment that wraps around what you're doing. And you also need effective implementation methods. And all of those things combined will lead you to the outcomes that you desire. So in keeping with Liz's cartoon theme, this is one of my favorite about implementation science, where it's like, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. So step 2 is kind of filled by implementation science. So we, as Liz said, that there's a huge knowledge to practice gap. We know a lot of great things that just never get brought to life. So people, you just don't achieve the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve. So implementation science is that miracle, although it's certainly no miracle, that is in the middle of that equation. So, and again, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about all of the active implementation frameworks within implementation science, but just helpful for you to understand where these usable innovations, these well-defined practices fit. So we've used the National Implementation Research work as part of our foundation for our implementation framework. And there are 5 active implementation frameworks. One is implementation stages. So implementation occurs along a bit of a trajectory. Usable innovations. So this is that program or practice of known dimension. Implementation drivers are sort of like the, excuse me, the key ingredients to implementing. So leadership and training and performance measurements and things like that you have to attend to when you're implementing. Improvement cycles they can be plan, do, study, act cycles, for example, but different ways that you learn as you go. It's developmental evaluation, essentially, where you're gathering information and making changes to ensure that your implementation is meeting the need. And then implementation teams. So the people that do this work are a really important aspect of implementation. So the stages, there are 4 implementation stages. And really, again, this is just in service to locating us and the tools we're going to discuss in the process. So exploration is the first stage where you're just sort of assessing readiness, trying to understand the need of your stakeholder, whether that's an agency or a community. You're sort of examining different innovations, you're looking at evidence, and you're trying to select the most appropriate option to implement. Installation is where you sort of roll up your sleeves to start developing a specific implementation plan and trying to make sure the ground is fertile to implement. Initial implementation is where you're getting started. You just get going, you learn as you go. A lot of improvement cycles happen in that stage. And full implementation is sort of the objective, where whatever innovation you've selected is now business as usual. It's like it's always been done that way, and everything is occurring as you intended. So for us, the two tools we're going to focus on around selecting your innovation sort of live in the exploration stage. So we'll look at both the hexagon and the practice profile. And this is really about trying to make sure that whatever it is you're going to do, whatever you're going to put in place, well matches community needs, it's aligned with evidence, you have the resources and ability to execute it. So for an innovation to be usable, it has to be very concrete, very specific. So again, if we think of the recipe analogy, when you share a recipe with someone, you do it in a way where they can easily understand it, they can see it, they know what you mean, it's replicable, it's very tangible. We want our innovations to be teachable, so you should be able to tell someone else how to do it. They should be able to learn it. It should be something that you can enact. There's behaviors involved in that. And it should be able to be readily assessed in practice. So you should be able to see it happening, see it unfolding as you intend. So the sort of four components of that are a very clear description of the innovation, of what it is that you want to do. The identified critical components. So what are the pieces of the puzzle that must be in place for this innovation to come to life? Operational definitions of those critical components means how will you know that it's happening? How do you tangibly articulate what those components are? And the practical performance or fidelity assessment is really about a means to measure or determine if you have stayed true to the innovation that you identified. So we're going to get into the tools here. So the first one I'm going to speak to you about is the hexagon tool. So in active implementation, selecting the innovation, as I said, is a key milestone of the exploration stage. So this is where you're deciding what you're going to do. And research has shown that there are some specific factors that support the selection of an innovation that is more likely to be successfully implemented. So again, this is a National Implementation Research Network tool that we have used and adapted in a number of different ways. So it allows you to sort of evaluate a potential innovation or practice based on those 6 key factors that research has shown are really important. It's very often used to decide on an innovation, but you can also use it to critically examine an innovation that you've already selected. And really the objective is to well match your innovation to the needs of your community, to the evidence that you have at hand, to the resources that you have, so that you can decide whether to move forward or not with that particular innovation. So a number of different benefits and uses for the hexagon tool, sort of starting at the top. As I said, it's an exploration and decision-making tool. It's really, the 6 factors cover a lot of ground, so it allows a very systematic approach to making informed decisions. It really spurs bringing forward the best available evidence that you have at hand. It's very pragmatic in terms of the process to decide. You want to make sure that whatever you choose is practical and feasible. It can help you learn about what you don't know as well. So if there are missing pieces of information around the innovation, that's really important to know up front, because you're going to need to do the work to fill in those gaps later. It's very helpful to compare and contrast options to try to find the best fit. And it's where you sort of start to see or hear the level of enthusiasm or lack thereof for your innovation. So through this very systematic, facilitated decision-making discussion, you get a sense of where people stand around the potential innovation.
So this is just an example of some of the key questions and the 6 factors that I mentioned. And you can customize or contextualize the questions in each of these areas. So the first area is need. So is the innovation necessary? Do you have data or evidence or information to indicate that this innovation is needed in your agency or in your community? Fit is really about strategic alignment. So is there a fit between the innovation and the needs of your target implementers? Does it well align with other organizational, community, or system strategic goals and directions? Is it complementary to other initiatives? Resources is about having the resources to put the innovation in place. In large part, that is financial resources, but there's also resources that relate to having the right people and the ability to train or support them in building their capacity. Evidence is the 4th factor, and this is about evidence for the new approach. Can you demonstrate that it will have a potential positive impact? Has it been used elsewhere? Is there positive outcomes with a particular innovation somewhere else that you can learn and draw from? Readiness for replication is really about how well defined something is. So do you know enough about it to choose it? And how much work is it going to be to actually define it? And there are times when something is very, very manualized and you could pick it up and apply it somewhere else quite easily. And there's other innovations that you're going to have to build as you go. And it doesn't mean that either of those choices is better or worse. It just means you're going to have to do a different type of work at the outset. So is there anyone that you can learn from? Is somebody already doing this that you can learn and draw on their experience? And then the 6th variable is capacity. So do you have the minimum knowledge, skills, and ability to implement the innovation? And if you don't, can you build that capacity? And then ultimately, do people want to do it? Is there buy-in to the practice? So all other factors being considered, what is the level of engagement around it? So capacity is really where the rubber meets the road around the innovation. So the hexagon is something that you can score. First of all, you sort of use the 6 factors to generate some discussion to identify the areas of strength and areas of weakness of your innovation along all 6 of those factors. So you try to sort of bring to bear all of the information you have in those 6 areas to facilitate this discussion. You want to sort of record any further information or action that might be required. So as I said, one of the things a hexagon can do is identify what you don't know, what you need to know, who you need to talk to, where you need to gather more information. And then you score each factor on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. So 5 would be the highest score, 1 would be the lowest score. So for example, for fit, if something doesn't really strategically align with other things happening in your organization or community, you might score that lower than something that is really well aligned with everything else, and there's a lot of synergy that you can identify up front. So I've used this in a number of different ways. I've facilitated a large group discussion where each person scores the innovation for each of the 6 factors, and then we just add and average the scores. So just sort of some notes on the scoring of the hexagon. So again, the score is important, but it's not a you must follow the numbers. If you're looking at multiple innovations and you're trying to make a decision and you have scores for each of them, that's really great, but it's really important to check in around a consensus regarding the scoring. So scores notwithstanding, how are we feeling about this? Are we okay to move forward? And really the important element of the hexagon is less about the numbers and more about the opportunity to have very purposeful, focused, and systematic, all-encompassing discussions so that everybody understands the innovation and how it may or may not fit. A low score in one or two of the sections doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't move forward. It just means that you know there's extra work to be done there. There's additional information or resources that you might need to make implementation possible, and it's important to identify that from the outset. All right, so we're going to give the hexagon a try. So I'll tell you now just to get a piece of paper handy and a pen, because I'm going to ask you to just jot down some scores in a moment. So just a very practical, I guess Liz and I maybe both need a vacation or something, because this has a relationship to her example earlier. So we're going to decide what vacation to go on. So option A is Paris, Ontario, Canada, if anyone knows where that is. There's a lovely campground there. So going camping for a week. And option 2 is a week-long sightseeing vacation in Paris, France. So it's Paris, Ontario versus Paris, France. And here are some of the considerations across the 6 hexagon factors. So need. Does the type of vacation meet your needs? Are you looking to be totally relaxed, keep it simple, not go too far, or are you looking for a high energy, constant activity, moving from A to B sort of a vacation? So do you want low key or do you want high energy? For fit, some of the guiding questions might be, does the vacation fit with your family's needs? Are you taking the kids along, or is it just you and your partner? And that certainly might influence your decision. Resource availability. Well, clearly going to Paris, France is a lot more resource intensive than camping for 1 week in Paris, Ontario. So do you have the money for that extravagant vacation? And have the time to travel to France? It might extend your vacation time because of that travel. Evidence. Have you ever camped before? Do you know how to start a campfire? Do you think that you'll enjoy it? People recommended Paris, France in certain activities. Maybe you've been in Europe before and you've really loved it. You don't have a problem with flying a long transatlantic flight. So these are some of the factors you might consider for evidence. Readiness for replication. So do you have what you need to implement? For camping, you need a lot of gear. You need a tent and sleeping bags, maybe a Coleman stove, your cooler, etc. For France, if you don't have a passport, that's going to be a serious impediment. Do you have Euro? Do you have your hotel and flight information? Have you done that kind of research? And then again, capacity to implement is where the rubber meets the road. Can you actually do it? Are you an experienced camper? Are you a well-seasoned traveler? So this is just an everyday example of how you can customize the guiding questions in the 6 areas to your specific circumstances. So now I'm going to ask you to score it. So grab that pen and piece of paper that I mentioned earlier and quickly jot down in the 6 different areas what your score is for both Paris, Ontario and Paris, France. So again, remember 1 is the lower score, 5 is the highest score, and I'll just give you 2 minutes to do that. And maybe type in the chat box if you wouldn't mind when you're done, so I know where people are at. I'll just give you maybe 1 more minute. I'll just flip back to the guiding questions if that's helpful. All right, so I think we have a poll that we can open up so I can get a sense of what vacation people have chosen? There we go. What did you choose? So, so far, Paris, Ontario camping is in the lead. Evening out now. Maybe you can also just type quickly in the chat box if there was a particular factor that most influenced your decision overall. Yeah, so Susan has said expense. So that score in the resource availability category is a really, it's a really big one, I think, for this decision. And that is indicative of the experience of using the hexagon. There may be a factor that really has more weight than the others. So there. Hopefully we got you a head start on thinking about where you're going to go this summer. Paris, Ontario is lovely, by the way. There's no Eiffel Tower, but it is lovely. Okay, so thanks for that. And then just if you could type in the chat box your thoughts. Oh, Monica has no decent camping skills. Yeah, that can be a challenge. You may starve to death camping if you can't start a campfire. So maybe just take a moment to type in the chat box. If you think that you might be able to use the hexagon tool in your work, can you think of any uses for it? How might you use it? Any ideas? Thoughts? Just while folks are typing, I'll note that I think one of the important uses for the hexagon that I should have mentioned before is also you can evaluate or reevaluate something you're already doing. So just because we've used a program or an intervention or an innovation for a really long time doesn't mean it still is well aligned with our current state. So I think all of us sort of engage in things and we do things in a certain way because that's what we've always done. And I think it's really important to also be reflective and to critically examine what you're doing. And the hexagon can be a helpful way to do that. Instead of adding more and more and more programs or innovations or interventions, you can start to critically examine what you're doing. So if you're going to do something new, what comes out in place of that? It is a very straightforward, Melissa said, it's a straightforward decision-making tool, and it is. And I think it's flexible enough that you can customize it. You can use it in a lot of different circumstances. And I think the thing to remember is the scoring is great, and it's helpful because it almost forces people to make a concrete decision. But the really important piece is the dialogue that you would have wrapped around that. So we've got a few ideas in the chat box for how you might use it. So maybe to evaluate a clinical intervention, yep. Intervention and program evaluation, product design and partnership, used for current and potential interventions, yep. That's great, Melissa. That's what I was suggesting. You can critically examine what you're doing now to see if it still fits. It might have fit when you started doing it, but it might not align very well presently. To identify barriers to implementation, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that is important. You might not have all the information you need, but it will start to reveal the things that you're going to have to really do a lot of work on, that you're going to have to build as you go. So thanks for that. I'm going to move on quickly to sort of defining your innovation. So this is sort of the next step. Once you have selected what you're going to do, You can use a tool called the Practice Profile, which is, again, a tool developed by the National Implementation Research Network to help you define what that innovation will look like in practice. So this is about precisely defining those recipe ingredients and making that recipe replicable. So you want to think of all of the critical components of your innovation, and you want to describe them in a way that is very specific. They're observable and they're measurable. You'll be able to see them in action. You'll be able to measure whether they've happened as you intended. It also starts you thinking about outcomes right from the beginning. So it gives you a foundation for monitoring your progress and evaluating your impact. It gets you thinking about the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you're going to need to put that innovation in place. And particularly if you're working with a group, it's really helpful to create a shared vision and a common language. So we think everybody's on the same page. This actually provides a foundation in black and white to ensure that we're on the same page. It can support the scale and spread of innovation. So if you've tried something in one place and you want to scale it up and use it elsewhere, you have sort of your playbook, essentially, that you can use to replicate that. And remembering that the end goal is to have people do something differently. So it really keeps you on track. It's a vehicle to operationalize, define, and refine your innovation. It's a touchstone to go back to make sure you're staying aligned with what everyone had mutually agreed upon. It's a building block to the next steps of implementation and using the implementation drivers, which is one of those other active implementation frameworks I mentioned. And as I said, it gets you thinking about evaluation up front so that you know whether you've done what you've agreed upon. So I'll quickly run through this. So the practice profile is in two parts. The first is really helps you to hone in on what your critical components are. So a critical component is an element that you consider crucial to the success of your innovation. To use sort of to stay with the recipe analogy, if we're making chicken soup, chicken noodle soup, one of the critical components you might identify is that you need broth. Without broth, you're not going to have much of a soup. The ideal implementation is the description of the implementer behavior. So what are the actions that you will see somebody engaged in that will help operationalize that critical component and realize the intended outcome? So in the case of broth, the gold standard or ideal implementation might be homemade from a whole chicken broth, simmered for 8 hours, a really rich homemade broth. Your acceptable variation are things that might not be ideal because we don't always live and work in ideal circumstances, but it will still help you achieve your goal. So though it's not the gold standard and it's not the utopian ideal, a really good quality store-purchased broth will still allow you to make your chicken soup. An unacceptable variation is the description of implementer behavior that will be a barrier to enacting that critical component and meeting your objectives. So in this case, beef broth would be unacceptable. You no longer have chicken noodle soup. And the expected outcomes, so describing what the outcomes are if that component is operationalized as you would like it to be. And then in part 2 of the practice profile, you sort of move that critical component into part 2. And then the second column, which is ideal or acceptable actions, you kind of summarize what you've decided you would do. Oftentimes, this is a combination of the gold standard and acceptable variation. So again, this takes into account context and that we don't always live in utopian circumstances. But what do you think you can do that will help bring that critical component to life? Knowledge, skills, and abilities are sort of the building blocks for operationalizing that critical component. So what learning or capacity building activities have to happen to support putting that in place? The driver analysis is the connection to the implementation drivers, which we've not covered in details here today, but this is where you start to think about those. because those drivers are going to be really important when you're developing your detailed implementation plan. And the evaluation or outcomes will be how are you measuring it? How will you identify the impact or the outcome? So we'll do a quick activity. So if you can just type in the chat box, we'll use, again, a really practical example of practicing good oral hygiene. So tell me, what are the critical components of good oral hygiene? So just type your ideas in there. Yeah, having the tools, electric toothbrush, floss, flossing, teeth brushing and flossing daily. Yeah. Good food choices. Yeah, absolutely. A regular routine, flossing, brushing, dental checkups. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So quite a few of you said brushing your teeth. But what does that mean? That in and of itself is a critical component. I think we can all agree that that's a viable critical component. But how do we do it? How often do we do it? With what tools do we use? How do you put that in place? So assuming correctly that most people would think brushing your teeth is a good part of oral hygiene, I've gone ahead and put this example into the part 1 of the practice profile. So if brushing our teeth is a critical component of good oral hygiene, the ideal implementation of that might be, I'm going to brush in the morning, I'm going to brush after each meal, I'm going to brush before bed, I'm going to brush with medium pressure, I'm going to go in the direction of my gums, I'm going to brush for 2 minutes each time, and I'm going to use a good quality toothpaste with fluoride. An acceptable variation, because that's a lot of brushing, is, okay, at minimum, I'm going to brush twice a day, morning and night. I'm going to brush for 1 minute in the directions of my gums using medium pressure, and I'm going to use toothpaste. An unacceptable variation might be, I'm not even going to brush twice a day. I'm not going to use my toothpaste. I'm going to use my finger because I forgot my toothbrush, and that's an unacceptable variation. The expected outcomes of brushing your teeth, of that critical component, if it's well operationalized, are clean teeth, fresh breath, healthy gums, and hopefully no cavities. So then we go to part 2 of the practice profile and move that critical component of brushing here. And in the ideal acceptable actions column, it's sort of a combination of the gold standard and the acceptable variation. So all things considered, what will help me achieve the objectives that I identified and what is feasible and realistic. So what I've moved here is I'm going to brush twice a day, morning and night. I'm going to brush for 1 minute or more in the direction of my gums. I'm going to use medium pressure, and I'm going to use toothpaste. What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that I need to put that component in place? Well, I need to learn the importance of brushing, and I need to be shown how to brush teeth properly. I'm not sure if others have had this experience, but in elementary school, they came and they had a giant set of teeth and a giant toothbrush, and they showed me how to brush properly. And so I was taught that. That was a skill that was built based on that learning. So the driver analysis is the connection to the implementation drivers, which, again, we haven't discussed, but training is one of the drivers. So someone has to teach you how to brush it properly. Coaching is another driver. So you want someone to check in to see whether you're doing it right and provide you some feedback. So parents will often do this, or caregivers will often do this for children, to say, okay, well, you didn't brush for long enough, or you didn't reach right back to the back there to get those new molars, etc. And systems intervention is sort of the context in which you're brushing. So do you have water, do you have toothpaste, toothbrush, are all of these core ingredients available? And then the evaluation outcomes are very specific. How will I measure whether I've been successful? Well, I'll go to the dentist and I'll get a checkup, and I'll have no cavities at the 3-month checkup. And I'll be able to, if somebody wants to see me, demonstrate how to brush my teeth correctly. So just a quick second to see if people have any thoughts about how you might use the practice profile in your work. Do you see this as being applicable in terms of starting to formulate a detailed description of a program or practice or innovation? Just move on while people are typing. Yeah, Helen has said this is helpful with regard to evaluation. I think it's a really important element of bringing evaluation into the dialogue up front. And in fact, in practical application of the practice profile, I have often started with identifying my critical component and then shifting my focus over to the far right column to evaluation so I can identify my objectives, because it sort of leads you to identifying your ideal or gold standard behaviors if you identify your objectives first. So just sort of a summary, some takeaway messages. Really, in order to successfully implement, the innovation must be clearly defined. You have to know very specifically and operationally what the practice or innovation is going to look like on the ground. And again, this is particularly important when you're working with collaborative partners, as we all often do, so that everybody is on the same page around what's coming to life within your organizations and your communities. A clear definition supports fidelity. How do you know what you're staying true to if you don't have it well defined? And it helps you to think about capacity building that you might undertake based on the critical components. So what are the things that you need to teach, to learn, to do, to give people the tools to put the innovation in place? And the last slide here is just some links for more information, because we really barely scratched the surface of implementation science. I've given you a little bit of a peek at the hexagon and practice profile, but there's a lot more to learn and to explore. So the first link is to the eye-to-eye that Liz mentioned earlier. The next one is implementation science, so this is NERN, the National Implementation Research Network. The next two are on the hexagon and practice profile specifically, and different applications for that. And then the final one says a little bit more about the Provincial System Support Program and our approach to implementation and some of the ways that we've used and adapted implementation. Kim has a question about sharing the presentation. I'll let my Mental Health Commission partners respond to that.
Thank you very much, Kim and Liz. Kim, to answer your question, the presentation is downloadable right now. At the top of your right of your screen, you should see the presentation that you can download now. We will also post it on our website at a later date with the recording. So we do have time for a couple of quick questions. We have a question in the context of having multiple usable innovations, is it efficient to use the hexagon tool for all possible usable innovations?
Yeah, I mean, I've used that the hexagon in practice that way on a number of occasions, where you've identified a particular challenge or gap or need that you want to affect positive change on. You've done a little bit of preliminary digging of what might affect positive change on that gap or issue that you've identified, and you try to gather at least some preliminary information around all of the potential innovations across the 6 factors of the hexagon. So I guess how efficient it is depends on how much depth you want to go into in each of those 6 factors. But it is a helpful way, as I said, to compare and contrast different options for innovations in a way that's systematic and transparent to everyone involved in the decision-making process. If you have a myriad of of innovations to choose from, you might want to start with shortlisting some of them by identifying some really fundamental basic selection criteria so that you can choose, several or a handful at most to bring forward to use the hexagon with.
Great, thank you. And we have time for one more question. Are all of the key factors of the hexagon tool of equal weight?
No, not necessarily. I think that's part of why, all things being equal, when you come out the end with a score, you still have to make sure that you have a true consensus around that. Absolutely, and our example around the vacation was a good example of that. That you might have 5s in every category but resources, and that in and of itself is going to be a significant limitation. But when you score, it does, you're adding your scores and then you're dividing by the 6 areas, so you get your overall score. But it really is circumstance dependent. You and your collaborators might determine that there's a particular variable that is kind of a make or break variable, and resources are a good example. Readiness for replication, for example, if you have a limited amount of time to implement an innovation or program or practice, and it is not well defined, it takes an awful long time to build a consensus around what it is that you will be doing. So if you know that you don't have the time for that for whatever reason, that readiness for replication piece might be important. Also, in some circumstances, the fit might be of primary importance. If you're working in a community, you want to make sure you're strategically aligned with your partners, because you know that not being strategically aligned around your particular innovation is going to present considerable challenge as far as implementation. So no, they're not always equal, and that's part of the beauty of having that discussion very systematically and transparently with your partners.
Great. So I just want to remind everybody that we will have a satisfaction survey that should either pop up once we end the webinar. Otherwise, you will receive an email, and we do encourage you and ask that you do complete it, just so it helps us know how we're doing and identify any other opportunities or areas of interest for future webinars. Aside from that, on behalf of the KE Collaborative team, I would like to again thank our speakers, Kim Baker and Liz Wickfield, for their great presentations. And thank you all for joining us today. This concludes the webinar, and we hope to see you at the next KE Collaborative webinar in the near future. Thank you.